concept creep, and especially on how it relates to issues of interest to you, that is in the philosophy of psychiatry. What I'll try to do as I go through is give a kind of analysis of what I think concept creep is, talk a little bit about the empirical evidence for it, and it isn't specifically a concept having to do only with the psychiatric domain, it's broader than that. Then I'll try to speak a little bit about how it relates to issues of mental illness. I'll talk a bit about some empirical work there as well. And I'll close with some fairly half-baked ideas about how this all relates to interesting thoughts to do with looping effects or ironic effects in this space. So we'll see how we go, and hopefully there'll be some chance for me to deal with some searching philosophical questions towards the end. So when I find it creepy, it's something like this: the progressive semantic broadening of harm-related concepts. When you say it like that, it's fairly brief. Again, generally is that my argument is that for a class of concepts having to do with harm, that is suffering, damage, ideas in that general semantic vicinity, there's been a gradual increase in the range of phenomena that these harm concepts refer to. So the focus throughout this, again, I won't pretend to be a philosopher here, is on the extension of the concept. I'm making a claim that over historical time, there has been a tendency for particular harm concepts to come to refer to a wider scope of cases. I argue that concept creep isn't unitary, that it occurs along two different dimensions, or if you like, has two different forms, which I'll attempt to clarify soon. And I argue that it probably has what you could call mixed blessings. It's a double-edged sword. Also, although this broadening of harm concepts may have some very desirable social and cultural impacts and maybe personal impacts on identity as well, it could also potentially have some concerning implications as well. And I also argue that it's no one single thing driving this tendency for harm concepts to broaden their meanings. This semantic inflation is another expression I tend to use, but that probably is multiply determined. There's an array of possible causes for this. So in terms of mixed blessings, again, I won't go into great detail here, but I mean, obviously, if you start broadening the range of phenomena that are identified as examples of harm, that could be a good thing. That could problematize bad behavior. Things we previously tolerated by not identifying them as forms of harm. Once you identify them as forms of harm, once you expand a harm concept so that it encompasses them, that appropriately problematizes intolerable behavior. By increasing the scope of harm, of course, you increase the range of moral concern or empathic concern you might have for people who are suffering or who are being maltreated, and that will, of course, motivate attempts to reduce that harm. So these are some possible benefits. On the other hand, if harm concepts inflate too much, you could say that will tend to create a sort of caricature universe, moral universe of villains and victims. You could argue that if harm concepts broaden too much, if the threshold at which we identify harm lowers too much, you could create excess sensitivity or vulnerability. And you could argue that if we have concerns about reducing harm, which are, if you like, too sensitive, or the threshold for defining harm is too low, that might end up inhibiting free expression and other things we care about. What might drive it? Again, I don't have a fully worked out theory of this, but I think there's three possible kinds of explanation. You could say that certain people might expand harm concepts deliberately in an attempt to problematize behavior for a particular social or political goal. So Cass Sunstein, the eminent law professor, has referred to this work on concept creep when he talks about opprobrium entrepreneurs, the idea that certain people deliberately attempt to increase the range of behaviors or experiences that are judged to be shameful in order to condemn them, in order to put them in a category that's stigmatized. So the conceptual broadening here can be done deliberately, to serve a kind of purpose. Again, a funny example, which is not really to do with harm at all. Some of you may have heard about the long-eared bat winning the New Zealand Bird of the Year. A bat is not a bird, but yet for the purposes of preserving this endangered creature, it was the again, this is a facetious example, but a deliberate attempt to broaden the concept so as to achieve some goal. When harm had occurred, or when dots were blue versus purple, was responsive to the prevalence of harm or dots of particular colours in a series of stimuli. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of how this works, but the authors of this paper show that judgments about when, for instance, a research proposal is ethical versus unethical is partly conditioned by the distribution of prevalence of unethical research proposals in the set being judged, and that if you reduce the frequency of unethical research proposals, for instance, people's threshold for deciding when something is unethical tends to lower. So to some extent, conceptual change could be responsive to the frequency of actual events in the world. Or you can make a more cultural kind of explanation, which is the one I tend to favour, which is that for some reason or other, there has been a growing sensitivity to or vigilance for harm going on in some of our cultures that is maybe allied to a particular set of political principles, to a rise in a morality based on harm and care, and maybe a shift away from materialist values to those more having to do with personal welfare. In any case, I'm not going to go into too much cultural speculation because it's all speculative, but just to say, here's some of the factors that might be driving this broadening of harm concepts. Another way I like to explain this, to hopefully make it a bit intuitive, this idea of what I mean by concept creep, before I give you a better example, is a nice visual analogy. At least I think it's nice. So some of you might be aware of some work on colour perception done by Berlin and Kay back in the late 1960s, where they tried to map colour concepts for people from different language communities. And they had a set of 320 colour chips from the Munsell Company of Ohio, somewhere I think it is. And they simply got people from different language communities to identify what they would call each of these chips. And the idea was you could find out what the local color lexicon was, and you could map the extension of those color concepts by seeing which of the chips were identified by which words. And what they found was that every language they looked at, speakers had an equivalent or a corresponding concept to the English concept of red, but that the breadth of those concepts was very different in different languages. So here are 4 languages. In Mandarin, Hung only refers to just 3 of the chips, at least according to speakers of Mandarin. Indonesian, you get a sort of narrow band, and I should have said, I forgot to say this, the horizontal dimension here has to do with hue or wavelength, whereas the vertical dimension has to do with a kind of intensity. So the Indonesian red equivalent is narrow in terms of its hue, but it's broad in terms of its intensity. The Tiltal Central American ka is broad horizontally, has a range of hues, but a narrower range of intensities. And Catalan has a very broad range, both of hue and of intensities. My argument when I'm talking about concept creep is that imagine a situation where a concept was starting like Hung and ending like Vermeil. It would be undergoing a process of broadening so that the concept was changing to expand along these 2 dimensions of hue and intensity. And hopefully I'll clarify what I mean by this here. So essentially, concept creep is the tendency for particular harm concepts to refer to a smaller set of phenomena at one time and a expanded, inflated set at a later time. So when I wrote the first paper on this 7 years ago, what I tried to do was to simply come up with an early version of this account, give some case studies of how I thought this process, sort of parallel processes of semantic inflation, were occurring in six concepts of interest to psychologists: abuse, addiction, bullying, mental illness, prejudice, and trauma, and speculate a bit on what might cause and result from these conceptual changes. It did get a little bit of attention in the US, and less so down here in Australia. We're always a bit slow. But let me just give you an example, just a very brief version of, just to make it a bit more concrete. Again, not really a psychiatric example. So bullying, the idea of bullying, at least in psychology, which has always been my main focus, came out of the work of a Norwegian psychologist called Dan Olweus in the 1970s. And at the time, Olweus was trying to define bullying as a very specific kind of peer aggression in childhood. He was at great pains to focus on or to declare that this was a very particular kind of aggression. And it was a kind of aggression that was, he argued, repeated. So you couldn't be accused of bullying someone, at least accurately accused of bullying someone, unless there was repeated aggression or intimidation. That aggression or intimidation had to be intentional, and it had to be conducted in the context of a power imbalance where a bigger, older, or larger number of kids was unpleasant to a smaller, weaker, younger kid. And in addition, the focus always, when Olweus was asked about what kinds of behaviours constituted bullying, it was always in acts of aggression and intimidation, not omissions. And over time, if you look at how psychologists have started to use the word bullying, each one of these criteria has relaxed over time. So, for instance, we no longer require that bullying be repeated. And there are certain cases like cyberbullying where there really is no repetition in the usual sense. There is simply the single act, which is just getting reverberated through social media channels. There's no longer a requirement that the behavior is intentional. There's no longer a requirement that bullying can only take place downwards in some power hierarchy. So when I complete my university's human resources modules, I'm told that I can not only, in principle, bully my juniors, but also I can bully my seniors and those who are at the same academic rank as myself. So we now allow power imbalance not to be a criterion for, or at least downward movement in the power imbalance, not to be a criterion for identifying bullying. Also, there's been a move away from this idea that bullying is only something that occurs in playgrounds. It also occurs in boardrooms and offices. So there's been a huge proliferation of research on bullying among adults. And meanwhile, when we talk about bullying among children, there's been a greater and greater focus on omissions, on shunning, on neglect, rather than active brutalizing other people. So bullying is just referring to a much wider range of acts than it used to. What I try to say is that concept creep takes two different forms, sort of corresponding to hue and intensity. I refer to horizontal concept creep occurring when a concept broadens to include new kinds of phenomenon. So I would say that the expansion from a childhood focus to an adult focus is a kind of horizontal concept creep. That is, bullying behavior is extended by analogy from children beating up other children to adults being inappropriate in their performance demands in workplace settings, for instance. I also talk about vertical concept creep, more to do with intensity, where the concept broadens to include milder, less severe, more subtle variations of some behavior. So the relaxation of the repetition and intentionality criteria, for instance, I would see primarily as a way of allowing less severe kinds of behavior still be called bullying. I'm calling it vertical, vertical concept creep because it's expanding the concepts to have a lower threshold. Milder behavior is seen as an example of the phenomenon. And again, this is all overly complex here, but I'd have a review paper that I'm very happy to send to people if they're interested, which tries to put some of the different causes, consequences, and complications of this idea into practice. And before we sort of move forward, I think this is an interesting idea, and hopefully some of you will agree by the end of this, because it's arguing that there is something generalized about the expansion of harm-related concepts. So although you might refer to the broadening of concepts of mental illness, for instance, in terms of medicalization or psychiatrization or something like that, this concept creep idea is saying actually that might be understood, at least in part, in terms of a more general tendency for harm concepts to broaden. So whereas referring to the broadening of a mental illness concept might lead to a mental illness specific account of that change, or referring to broadening of the concept of prejudice might lead to a different account of what might be driving that conceptual change. A focus on harm as a broad concept that has been inflating, I think, offers new parsimonious ways of accounting for a suite of cultural changes that we're seeing. I also am not claiming that it's only harm-related concepts that broaden. All sorts of concepts broaden and narrow over time, nor am I saying that harm-related concepts invariably broaden. In actual time, some harm concepts might tend to broaden, narrow, stay the same. I'm only pointing to a sort of general tendency for harm concepts to broaden. The third most important thing I need to say is that some people appear to take the idea of concept creep as if it's an argument against conceptual change or a suggestion that concepts should not broaden. It isn't. It's simply a account of what is taking place. I'm not arguing that conceptual change shouldn't occur, or the particular broadenings of harm concepts shouldn't occur. It's not an intrinsically reactionary idea. It's just an idea of what might be happening in some of our harm concepts in some of our cultures. And I fully accept that conceptual change is inevitable and that this phenomenon has many positive effects. So again, this is, as I say, as you can already tell, not a philosophy talk, but a psychology talk that attempts to be interesting to philosophers. I'm going to just give you some overview of the kind of research that we've been doing on this topic. There's basically three kinds. With a very clever computational linguist, we've been trying to show patterns of semantic broadening in harm concepts using very large text corpora. We've been doing more standard psychological studies trying to understand who tends to hold broader concepts of harm. Now, of course, the understanding of which kinds of people tend to hold broader concepts of harm is not the same as the key claim about concept creep, which is a historical claim, but it might illuminate some of the things that drive concept creep. If you can find out which kinds of people in the present tend to hold broader harm concepts, that might help you understand or guess about what might be accounting for historical changes in harm concepts. And then we just started to do some more experimental social psychology work on what the implications might be of holding broad harm concepts. So let me just briefly run through some of these just to give you a flavor for what we're talking about here. So you can explore semantic change using the tools of natural language processing in very large text corpora. Essentially what you're doing in this sort of work is seeing whether word meanings change gradually or suddenly by exploring patterns in the semantic company particular words keep. So which words co-occur with it. It's called work on word embedding. And although a frequent focus of computational linguistic work on historical semantics has been on just tracking shifts in the focal meaning of words, and I've got some little images reflecting some of the ways in which words like, gay, broadcast, and awful have changed over time, which you might know. It's also possible increasingly to assess shifts in the breadth of concepts, not just what the primary meaning is, but whether word meanings have inflated over time. Essentially, you're modeling each word's meaning in terms of a number of semantic vectors, which are different contexts in which the word tends to be used. And if those vectors become more dispersed, which you can measure mathematically, that's taken as evidence of the meaning broadening. If the word is being used in the context of multiple, relatively independent semantic contexts. And we've been doing this for a while with two large corpora. One is one that we put together ourselves, composed of over 800,000 psychology article abstracts from close to 1,000 journals over a roughly 60-year period, which is a way of understanding how words might get used within the academic discourse of psychology. And we also use corpora which are carefully curated to represent a more general text, the corpus of historical and contemporary American English, just different ways of looking at academic and non-academic texts to try to see whether word meanings have changed in these different samples of discourse. And what we do when we look at a range of harm-related concepts, and we've looked at words, addiction, bullying, empathy, racism, trauma, harassment, various others as well, is that you do tend to find consistent evidence over a multi-decade period that the meaning of these harm concepts tends to broaden. I know that little table down in the bottom right isn't self-interpreting, but essentially every correlation with asterisks after it is supporting a hypothesis that over time, as a function of year, the semantic breadth of the concept in question is rising in the psychology abstracts corpus or in the sort of general corpus, the historical and contemporary American English corpus. So every time you see an asterisk there, you're seeing evidence that the concept is used more frequently over time and its meaning is dilating over time. And there's even also evidence we find for a causal link between the frequency with which words are used and the broadening of their meanings, so that using sort of econometric analysis, as words become more frequently used, they tend to acquire a greater diversity of meanings. So concept creep, it can be documented, we think, in this way. By the way, if you're wondering why the lines there are going down in that graph, going down means semantic broadening in terms of the index that gets used in this sort of work. I'm not going to go into technical details. I'm sure it's not terribly interesting. I'm just trying to give us a flavor of the sort of work that we do. Other findings you get out of the same sort of line of work are, I think, also consistent with the idea that harm, a broader rising salience of harm might be behind some of these phenomena that are occurring. If we look at if we track the frequency of harm-related words, a large set of them through the Google Books corpus, we find that harm concepts have increased in salience since about 1980. Over this time, and also as one side effect of some of the or component of some of the research we do, you can detect when the conceptual change is particular concepts is greatest, which decade, for instance. That's and you can also look at the particular verbal associates of the concept in question to see which ones are becoming stronger or more strongly associated with the concept of interest over time. So the heat map in the bottom right there is showing the words associated with bullying in 4 different decades, and as the numbers rise, that is saying the word in the row is more and more strongly associated with the concept of bullying. So you can see, for instance, the workplace bullying down the bottom there is becoming much more prominent. That is, workplace was not associated with bullying in the 80s, but it's strongly associated with bullying in the 2000s and 2010s as the concept of bullying moves into adult spaces in a way just from an exclusive focus on children. We also find that more generally there's been this just rising focus on harm, a rising relative frequency of harm-related words, both in the psychology corpus and less spectacularly just in Google Books in general. So again, speaking to a general tendency for concern with harm to be rising. If you look at individual difference work, here what we're trying to do is see which kinds of people tend to hold more expansive understandings of harm. So we measure the breadth of people's concept of harm by giving them examples of some hypothetical examples of cases where someone may or may not have experienced a trauma, may or may not have witnessed prejudice, may or may not have an addiction. You give people a range of sort of marginal or ambiguous examples, and you see, do they judge those examples to be instances of the harm concept of interest? People who identify more instances, examples of harm, have broader concepts by this way of thinking. And so what we then do is see what aspects of those persons predicts the breadth of their concept of harm. And we find a range of things do. So people who tend to have broader harm concepts tend to be more empathic, they tend to have more sensitivity to injustice, but they also tend to have somewhat greater personal vulnerability and somewhat greater concern with threats. There is a fairly strong relationship between having more liberal progressive political ideology and having broader concepts of harm. And there's also some demographic associations as well. So these differences between people are systematic. And they're also somewhat understandable in terms of a raft of personality, ideological, and other variables. And I think what I find interesting as well is that it is a generalized broadening of concepts of harm. People who have broader concepts of prejudice also have broader concepts of trauma. People who have broader concepts of mental illness tend to have broader concepts of bullying. There is a systematic tendency for people to have broader or narrower concepts of harm in general, not just specific to a particular concept such as prejudice or trauma or bullying, etc. I'll spare you this graph, it's not very helpful. We also do some things where we try to manipulate concept breadth and see what the impacts are. So if we're making an argument that concept creep might be consequential, might have implications that we could care about, you'd want to know that when you broaden people's harm concepts, that has some sort of corresponding effects. And we do find, for instance, that when you, in an experimental way, broaden people's harm concepts, we tend to find that the concept itself becomes trivialized or diluted in some way. If you give people examples of, if you give people a sort of broadened concept of what bullying is, they see bullying as less problematic, less concerning, less societally important, less something that needs to be dealt with. So there are some potential implications. Likewise, if you broaden people's concepts of harm, they are somewhat more likely to form polarized understandings of victims and perpetrators in conflict. Again, I might spare this in the interest of time, but I can go back to any of this stuff if you like later. Now, why you had me here was not to talk about this irrelevant stuff. It was to talk about mental illness related things. And let me just try to say a few things about this here. And this is all early work, and so it's not beautifully wrapped up into some kind of formulation. But I think the idea of concept creep as a tendency for harm-related concepts to broaden over time offers a useful perspective on some of the things that a lot of people in the psychiatry domain care about. Issues to do with pathologizing, issues to do with psychiatrizing, issues to do with diagnostic inflation and the tendency for psychiatric ideas to, if you like, colonize what was once called normality. And I think the benefits of a concept creep framing here are that it does help you think about diagnostic inflation or pathologization in two different ways, on two different dimensions. So what I call horizontal concept creep, this tendency for concepts to encompass qualitatively different phenomena, like bullying moving from childhood into also referring to adult behavior. One kind of concept creep is of that nature, but the other vertical form of concept creep is not so much colonizing new semantic territory, but rather broadening or loosening or dilating or diluting the threshold for identifying existing conditions. So many of the debates people have about shifts in diagnostic criteria from one edition of DSM to the next are issues to do with that question, whether we're extending downwards the criteria for identifying a particular condition. A second benefit of a concept creep framing is that rather than focusing specifically on mental illness in itself, I think it helps you see this broadening or this sort of diagnostic inflation in terms of harm as a broader concept. So rather than seeing diagnostic inflation just in terms of an attempt by someone or other to medicalize some phenomenon, let's say, you see it maybe as an attempt to identify a harm and to give it the kind of moral seriousness that identified harms receive. And a third, I think, benefit, I didn't express that very well, I'm sorry. A third benefit of this concept creep framing, I think, is that it's an attempt to understand not just professional or expert concepts of mental illness, but also folk or lay concepts as well, and how folk concepts and professional concepts might influence one another. So, I mean, let's just talk about horizontal creep. I think, you know, this sort of a fairly familiar story, but if you think about concept creep as having these two different dimensions, horizontal and vertical, it helps you understand diagnostic inflation in a more nuanced way. So here are the forms of mental illness, or classes of mental illness recognized by DSM-1. And if you want to talk about how professional concepts, at least DSM ones, of mental illness have broadened over time, essentially what you're seeing is a broadening to include entirely new domains of psychopathology being added across different editions of DSM. Again, you might quibble with some of these issues, but eating disorders weren't in DSM-1, sexual disorders weren't in DSM-1. This is a broadening of the concept of mental illness from one edition to the next. This is horizontal concept creep because it's adding entirely new, not necessarily milder or less severe, but entirely new kinds of phenomenon into the broad concept of mental illness. And likewise, a whole range of new ones get added by DSM-3. And I could have added that DSM-4 and 5, for instance, but it's one way of talking about a particular kind of diagnostic inflation. And I think it also helps you can do research from a concept creep background, which looks at the other kind of creep as well. So vertical concept creep, just to remind you, is where you broaden a concept by including milder, less severe instances, you know, kind of like relaxing a diagnostic criterion or lowering a threshold for identifying someone as a case of a particular condition. And one thing we did, a colleague of mine recently, was test the argument made by Alan Francis and others that there's been a kind of wholesale broadening of concepts of mental illness through successive editions of DSM, especially DSM-5, which I would say Francis's claim is essentially one that there is vertical creep operating, that normality has to be saved because our criteria for defining when mental illness occurs has relaxed so much. And again, this is just really an excuse to present a clinical study that I think might be of interest and you might not have come across. Essentially what we did in this study is we found every piece of research we could find, 123 papers, where the same group of people, they could be patients, they could just be community members, were diagnosed with a particular disorder using successive editions of the DSM. So you might have a sample of older people, let's say, who are diagnosed for depression using DSM-3R and DSM-4 criteria. And you simply get a ratio of the number of people diagnosed, or the prevalence of the condition in the later edition over the prevalence in the earlier edition. If that number is greater than 1, it's vertical creep. It's saying that the later edition is broadening the range of people who qualify for this diagnosis relative to the earlier edition. If the ratio is less than 1, it's the opposite of vertical creep. It's a contraction of, or deflation of, the concept of the illness, because fewer people are qualifying for the diagnosis in the later edition than in the earlier edition. And to cut to the chase, what we found in this study was that there's been absolutely no wholesale inflation of diagnostic concepts across DSM-3 to DSM-5. The average ratio is exactly 1, meaning there's been no generalized tendency for DSM disorders to broaden or shrink. The graph on the right is the number of conditions in this research which inflated versus deflated. So certain conditions are vertically creeping, are inflating, but others are deflating, and there's no generalized tendency for inflation over time. And I think this is sort of a handy thing to remember before we take at face value arguments that there's been this kind of wholesale diagnostic inflation, if you think about diagnostic inflation in terms of vertical creep, because it's unquestionably the case that in terms of horizontal creep, in terms of adding entirely new kinds of psychopathology, there has been broadening. Again, this will be meaningful in the meaningless, I should say, in the but it's just a summary of the meta-analysis, essentially just showing the proportion of inflation across different DSM editions. Again, this may be stuff that you couldn't care less about. I apologize if so, but if it is of interest, I can talk more later. I think this is especially important at the moment because one reason why vertical creep could be occurring or could be likely to occur in future is that there's been this rise in recent times, and again, I'm not sure whether this is philosophically interesting or something that people talk about. I think ideally one would. A rise in the recognition that most psychopathology occurs on a spectrum or is dimensional, to use the psychology jargon, that rather than there being objective discoverable category boundaries separating people who have and don't have a condition, as I think was the psychiatric common sense even 30 years ago, there's been this, I think, widespread acceptance that we're talking about continua now, and that I think is coming through in some of the alternatives we're seeing to DSM, like the high top model, which is explicitly favouring a dimensional view of psychopathology. Dimensional approaches are finding their way into DSM, into other approaches, and it also comes through in some of the work that I've done historically about trying to actually determine using research methods which are called taxometrics, which explicitly try to adjudicate between categorical and dimensional accounts of particular mental health problems. And I think this is diffusing out into the wider public in the form of what are called continuum beliefs. Again, this might be ideas that are entirely familiar to you all, but I think there's been a growing body of work within the study of stigma, for instance, on the implications of holding a view that mental illness is on a continuum with everyday variation, that there is no difference between ordinary unhappiness and neurotic misery, to use Freud's expression. So what I'm arguing here is that there's been a widespread recognition both within the professional discourse and I think within just folk discourse along the lines that there are no categorical boundaries in this space and that everything is on a continuum. And that I think is important because it does make it easier for vertical creep to take place. If there is no objective threshold, then the threshold can in principle broaden. Again, I've done some work on this just again as a side issue if anyone cares about the subtaxometrics, reviewing the research on whether or not there are latent categories in the domain of mental illness. And again, what we found, I think overwhelmingly, is evidence against the existence of categories. In every single one of 17 different domains of psychopathology illustrated in that plot on the right there is no aggregate support favouring a categorical model over a dimensional one. Just for context, the numbers of this index above 0.5 correspond to categorical findings. Those less than 0.5 point to dimensional models, but findings. Again, this may all be completely irrelevant to you as philosophers, but simply trying to say there is some I think fairly solid research findings supporting the general tendency for mental illness to be on a spectrum. So let's focus on that for a little while. Let me just check my time. I've got to hurry up a little bit. I think there are 3 lines of work we've been doing in this area as well. Looking at historical changes in mental illness concepts, looking at the correlates of individual differences in those concepts, and doing a little bit of early experimental work on the implications of holding broader concepts. And this might be of more relevance directly to you. One thing I think we've looked at in terms of historical changes is that there has definitely been a steep rise. I'm going to focus a lot of work from now on trauma. There's been a very steep rise in the cultural salience and semantic breadth of trauma over recent decades. The word is simply used vastly more than it used to be. The graph on the right is the relative frequency of the word trauma in psychology articles from 1974 to 2017, and you'll see that it's become an incredibly successful idea. And I think what's occurred, and I guess I'll just rush through this because I'm being a little bit behind time, in a paper called The Concept Creep of Trauma, I suggested that professional meanings of trauma have expanded in horizontal and vertical dimensions in 4 particular ways. There's been an early expansion of trauma from referring to something purely somatic to a sort of psychic tendency to see trauma as a psychic wound. There's been a move to see trauma as not simply something that may happen directly to you, but something that may happen vicariously. There's a tendency to see from trauma as something extraordinary to something that is just normal adversity. And there's a rising tendency to see trauma as something that's not experienced only in terms of personal adversity, but also collectively experienced, even historically experienced adversity. Likewise, this is just repeating some stats before. When we look at trauma using our computational linguistic methods, we also find that concepts of trauma have tended to broaden over time, and that broadening is driven, it seems, at least in part, by an increased rise in the use of the word trauma. The more the word trauma gets used, the broader its meanings tend to be in this work. Paper just published 2 days ago, we show the same thing in terms of the severity of or emotional intensity of words associated with trauma in the psychology corpus. If trauma was expanding downwards to refer to to milder kinds of experience, then you would expect the words that are occurring in the vicinity of trauma within psychology articles to be sort of less emotionally intense over time, and that, sure enough, is what we find. We find over time that words occurring in the vicinity of trauma are less emotionally intense, less negative, less arousing. We also are doing some work with my PhD student, Jessie C, on trying to measure differences in the breadth of people's concepts of mental illness. As always, we find huge differences. Some people have very low thresholds for deciding that some hypothetical person described in the vignette has an illness than others. Some people have very narrow concepts, some people very broad concepts. And we do find, surprisingly, I think, that this has a political dimension, that people who identify more on the left of politics tend to identify a wider range of phenomena as being mentally ill. You do find younger people tend to have broader concepts. You find that holding broader concepts of harm promotes help seeking. It's associated with having less stigmatizing attitudes. It's also, though, seen as associated with the belief that mental illness is almost ubiquitous, that it's on a continuum and that we're in the midst of a mental health crisis. So we're finding all of this evidence that those who hold broader ideas about what mental illness is tend to have an array of interesting demographic, political, and attitudinal characteristics. I think I'm probably just going a little bit too slow here, but please just forgive me. Just another 5 minutes, I'll try to be done. The experimental stuff we're doing is just very early. I think this is sort of interesting, though. One thing we've just done last year is see what might some of the implications be for broadening concepts of mental illness. And we do something as simple as this. We give people a short vignette description of someone who may or may not be experiencing a mental health problem of some sort. And in one condition, they see it without a diagnostic, and the other condition, they see it with a diagnostic label. The only difference is the diagnostic label. This is analogous to concept creep. Concept creep is the tendency to include more marginal examples under the under the heading of a particular diagnosis. So if you're labeling a marginal example as an instance of a mental disorder, you're essentially expanding the concept and seeing what the implications might be. And what we find is that if you give the very same description of a person who may or may not have a mental illness with a label, the person seems to show more compassion for that person. They think that there should be more accommodations made for them in terms of study, work, family responsibilities. They, of course, think that treatment is more appropriate for them, and they are more likely to believe that the person's problems are enduring. A diagnostic label carries all of these sort of implications of something being potentially part of someone's enduring identity, being something that entitles them to social care and pragmatic assistance in the form of accommodations. Diagnostic labels are beneficial to people, or at least seen as having desirability and value in a way I'm sure would not have been the case a decade ago. Again, pointing to some of the implications that might flow from broadened concept of disorder. Very briefly, I thought I'd have something to say about looping effects, which I thought might interest philosophers, but I didn't really get as far along with it as I'd want to. But I know there's a great deal of interest, or at least used to be, in Ian Hacking's work, and Sharif had taken, of course, has taken that a lot further, in the ways in which our classifications and ideas about mental illness might feed back into a sort of circle by affecting people's understanding of their own experiences, and you all know how this operates. And one way of thinking about this in terms of trauma, I think, is this idea is, in terms of concept creep, is that you can identify a kind of looping effect of this sort where broadened understandings about what trauma is in the profession might affect how lay people understand the idea, which may lead to broadened meanings, both horizontally and vertically, which may have implications for how they experience traumas, define traumas, and also experience the outcomes of trauma. And that in itself can embed, I think it can be said, trauma in people's identities, feeding into rises in in psychiatry's recognition of trauma-related pathologies. Let me try to just spell this out bit by bit, because I think now we're sort of coming towards a quite empirically solid understanding that this sort of loop is entirely plausible. So take the first bit, psychiatry's broadened definitions. I think it's very well documented that over historical time, there has, with a slight interruption with DSM-5, been a tendency for the definition of what a traumatic event is to broaden over time. And that is taken further by organizations such as SAMHSA in the USA, where its definition of what a trauma is vastly more inclusive than even DSM's is. We've also shown from the research that I've reported today that there has been a massive increase, not only in professional discourse, but also in folk discourse, general public discourse, on how often the word trauma is used. We've shown that word trauma, and this I think is an example that you could be replicated with many other relevant concepts, that trauma is now referring to a wider range of phenomena, both horizontally and vertically. That the rising cultural salience of the idea of trauma is driving an increase in what it means. We've got evidence from some empirical work by Jones and McNally from Harvard that if you do actually present people with a broadened concept of what trauma is, that is what is occurring at a cultural level, if you manipulate that in an experiment, they do tend to come with enhanced post-traumatic reactions when you expose them to a distressing experience. So broadened concepts can generate post-traumatic reactions. And there's also substantial research evidence that among trauma-exposed people, those who make trauma part of their identity, who see it as part of who they are, tend to have more enduring and severe post-traumatic reactions. And as I've said just in the study I presented a little bit earlier, now that diagnostic labels have become somewhat destigmatized and appealing and identity relevant, this may potentially be embedding mental health problems, feeding back into a sort of rise in the prominence of trauma as an explanatory idea within psychiatry. Very, very finally, again, I thank you for tolerating my wordiness. There's a fascinating paper that's just come out by Lucy Folks and Jack Andrews, which proposes something I think similar to this, as not due directly to shifts in word meanings, but simply the idea that maybe some of our mental health awareness campaigns, which are attempting to reduce suffering and broaden mental health literacy, may be having ironic or paradoxical effects. They put forward what they call this prevalence inflation hypothesis, where they're arguing that such awareness campaigns actually can lead people to overinterpret mild forms of distress as signs of mental health problems, which actually can, through self-fulfilling processes, lead to genuine increases in symptoms, which as outcomes increase the prevalence of the assessed prevalence of mental illnesses, leading potentially to a vicious cycle of paradoxical or ironic effects of mental health problems. Anyway, again, I didn't come close to giving this justice, but I think it's entirely compatible with the idea that I'm talking about with concept creep, that as you talk more about mental illness, as you raise the cultural salience of mental health problems, you play the risk perhaps of creating distress and harm. So again, grandiose endings, hopefully we'll have something to talk about, and some of these ideas resonate in some ways. But I do think this concept creep idea, I hope, has some implications for mental health concepts, even though it's not meant to be restricted to them. It's meant to be a broader idea relevant to harm in general, that it is not just someone in an armchair speculating on what might be going on in society, but actually has a growing body of empirical evidence behind it. And I think it maybe offers a worthwhile new perspective on issues to do with psychiatrization and diagnostic inflation that may be of interest to some of those present. So thanks very much for listening. Here are some of the colleagues, students I've worked with on this stuff. I'm very open to receiving emails and requests for papers from any of you. And while you're breathing a sigh of relief that I'm done, here's some of the papers that I was talking about for your interest.